Hello, everybody. It's, an opportunity to go back in time a little bit, all the way back to September 2023, when I was on my tour of the northern US states. And one of those visits was over to Muskegon, I think that's how it's pronounced. And there were a couple of ships to see there. Well, there was an LST, which we did see, and, well, something that's technically a boat, but still a very important museum ship to visit. And that is, of course, the submarine USS Silversides. So before we go aboard and have a quick look around, let's take a little bit of a look at the history of Silversides herself. As a member of the Gato class, Silversides didn't actually exist when World War II broke out. She was laid down in November 1940, just over a year before the US itself would get involved in the Second World War. She was launched in August 1941 and commissioned on the 15th of December 1941, just about a week after the attacks on Pearl Harbor. At the time that she was commissioned, she was put under the command of Lieutenant Commander Creed C. Burlingham. I think that's it. It's either Burlingham or Burlingame, but I'm going to go with Burlingham. He'd previously been in command of the somewhat older USS S-30, which unsurprisingly was an S-class submarine, and so being told that he was going to move over to Silversides just as the US Navy went to war was probably a great comfort to him because, well, the chances of coming back aboard Silversides were significantly greater than that of if you went to war aboard S-30. Burlingham would then take Silversides out on her first 5 war patrols, which lasted between April 1942 and July 1943, which means that his total period in operational command, if you count from the date of commissioning, was approximately a year and a half. In actual fact, just over that, as he had actually been given command of the sub before it had even been completed. During this time aboard Silversides, the sub managed to sink 11 enemy ships, or at least that's the number of confirmed sinkings, and a good deal of Silversides' more famous incidents would occur under his command, some of which we're going to cover later on in this video. Silversides generally would make quite a name for herself during the Second World War, but Burlingham stands out because he was having to sink enemy ships at a time when, as we've covered multiple times on the channel, let's just say his torpedoes were not going to be the most reliable of weapons. For patrols 6 through 11, command of Silversides would fall to Commander John S. Coy Jr., whose most recent underwater postings had been USS Shark and USS R-18. He would also command Silversides for about a year and a half, from July 1943, when he took over from Burlingham, to December 1944, during which time, in part thanks to the fact that his torpedoes now kind of worked, he managed to sink a total of 14 ships. Although towards the end of his tenure in command, targets were beginning to become a little bit thin on the ground, as, well, most of Japan's merchant shipping had already been sunk, although he did have a fair bit of excitement acting as a little bit of a decoy as Silversides, along with Trigger and Sterlet, worked together to rescue the badly damaged USS Salmon during Silversides' 11th war patrol. And Silversides' final commander during the war for patrols 12 through 14 was Commander John C. Nichols, or Nichols, possibly. Due to the increasing scarcity of anything with the Japanese flag remaining afloat between December 1944 and August 1945, they only managed to add 1 ship to Silverside's total, but did manage to also rescue 2 downed US pilots. By all accounts, Commander Nichols would also be in command of Silversides post-war until she was placed in reserve in the latter part of the 1940s. After a brief period in the reserves, Silversides was then pulled out of reserve to work as a training vessel. This explains why she's one of relatively few preserved US Navy submarines from the Second World War not to have undergone some form of guppy conversion, because she was in her World War II state or thereabouts at the end of the 1940s, and then not being in active naval service, but rather as a training vessel, they didn't see any need to make significant modifications. When she eventually left US naval service completely in 1969, Chicago, or more properly, the Chicago Chamber of Commerce, requested her as a memorial. Unfortunately, the 60s had not been kind to her, and the volunteers had to spend most of the 1970s cleaning her up and restoring her. But by the end of that decade, she looked almost in as new condition, and they'd managed to get some of her diesels working again. And then in the late 1980s, she was moved to her present home in Muskegon. And there she is to this day. And of note is the fact that although she was not the single highest scoring submarine in World War II, she is the highest scoring surviving submarine from World War II, and she was already in the top 5 in the US Navy at the end of the Second World War. Although, depending on exactly which source you read, she's credited with somewhere between 23 and 31 ships, of between 90 and 100,000 odd tons total displacement. But luckily it doesn't actually matter which of the figures is correct, because the aforementioned statistics and facts are still accurate. So with that brief teaser of her history done, let's go aboard the ship and see what we can find of particular note aboard a US Navy fleet submarine of the Second World War. So we're starting out here at the stern of the ship. You can see the prop guardrails there, and as we come around, we're going to walk past the exit hatch. That's where you come up out of the ship having done your tour, because you do the tour from the forward part of the ship to the aft. And as we're walking along, you'll see one of the first features that you'll find of any significant size is the ship's deck gun. Now, this is a 4-inch gun, and unusually compared to what you might think of for a lot of submarines, this is actually mounted aft of the submarine's sail. The 4-inch gun is itself a little bit unusual, as many US submarines were completed with a 3-inch deck gun, and quite a few would later upgrade to a 5-inch deck gun. 4-inch guns were not necessarily unknown aboard US fleet subs, but they're not the most common of weapons. However, this one is in good operational condition, and as you can see here, even the sighting mechanisms are still here. For those of you who can't quite read the writing going around there, it says 4-inch sight Mark 21 Mod 10, initial velocity 2,500 feet per second, and then it usefully tells you that you need to look up Ordnance Pamphlet number 172, dated June 1932, if you want to know how to use this device. Now you might be thinking, well, that's all very well, Drac, very nice 4-inch gun pointing aft. However, where do you get the ammunition for this thing? It's not like there's a ready-use locker or a magazine feed here, is there? Well, actually there is, just not in the way you'd expect from a ship. Of course, this is a submarine, so of course things are a little bit different. You do have an ammunition feed up from the submarine itself, down there at the bottom left, but you also have these ready-use lockers which are in cylindrical form either side of the aft end of the sail. With the 4-inch being a relatively fast-firing weapon with a well-trained crew, you could burn through the rounds that would be stored here rather quickly, and the feed up wasn't ever going to be quite as fast as a human chain gang just hauling shells out of here, so this gave you a good initial burst fire capability, while you could also then build up more ammunition from below if you had to get into prolonged deck gun engagement. Although, of course, being a submarine, you don't really want to have to get into a deck gun engagement if you can at all avoid it, and if you have to, you want to keep it quite short, because unlike a surface ship, a single hit to a submarine can rather badly compromise its operational capabilities. And then just above those ready-use lockers, still on the aft part of the sail, there is a Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft cannon, although, as those of you who've watched the channel for some time will know, US submarines were not averse to using the 40mm as an anti-ship weapon when they came across smaller Japanese craft. Also in this part of the sub is this plaque commemorating Mike Harbin, who was the first, and as it turns out, only man to die aboard as the result of combat. The incident occurred on the first patrol, barely over a week into it, when the sub came across a small enemy schooner, and they decided, well, the torpedo's probably worth more than the schooner, so let's sink it with gunfire. Unfortunately, it turned out that this particular schooner was actually armed and started shooting. The schooner was soon reduced to a flaming wreck by fire from the gun, but unfortunately one of its machine gun bullets managed to hit poor old Mike Harbin, and he was dead before he hit the deck. But, as said, this would be Silverside's first and only combat fatality. We now proceed down the starboard side of the sub, and as we come past you'll see the kill tally, including sunk and damaged ships, plus her hull number, 236, and we come onto the forward part of the ship. And what we've just come past there is a 20mm Oerlikon, which can be found on the forward part of the sail on a little platform. And much like the 40mm and 4-inch aft, it also has its little ready-use ammunition cylinders there right underneath it. So as we track forward, you'll notice just forward of this little cone, that is where we're going to enter the sub. But before that, we're just going to quickly head up to the bow. It's quite a large vessel, especially after having visited Chicago the day before and seen U-505. But as we come back, before we enter, you'll notice what looks like a little ski ramp just here on the bottom right. And this, of course, is where you reload the torpedoes, or if you've come back with a faulty one, where you can take them out. So obviously this ramp would not be deployed whilst the sub is at sea. It would be folded away nice and neatly. However, since the sub is alongside, it makes sense for it to be displayed in this manner. So torpedoes would be craned aboard. The sub doesn't have a crane capable of hauling the torpedoes itself. And then they would be placed on this slide and gently lowered through a hatch in the pressure hull and into the forward torpedo room. And there is the hatch in question. And now it's time, of course, for us to go aboard the sub. Now, granted, to most people, this is just how you get inside the sub and see what's in there. However, for those of you who like naval history and ships in general, and after all, you're watching this channel, so that's probably you, it actually gives a huge opportunity to see what's inside the outer casing of a sub, outside the pressure hull. So you can see this black cylinder below our feet. That is the pressure hull. That is actually the submarine itself. And all this other complicated apparatus above it would actually be submerged while the submarine is at sea, but is within the outer hull casing, and so you normally would have no idea that it's actually here. You can see why, therefore, the deck above is a slatted grid rather than solid, because water has to come in and out of this area fairly quickly so as not to adversely affect the submarine's ability to dive or indeed to float. So when the sub is diving, obviously water would come in through the little scuttles on the, in this case, at the bottom left of the picture, and air would escape out through the slats up top, and vice versa. When the sub is surfacing, water would exit those scuttle holes and air would come in through the slats at the top. And you can see there's quite a large volume, so it is quite necessary for this to flood and de-water itself pretty darn quickly. So there's a huge array of different bits and pieces of machinery vital to the sub's operation that you won't see from inside the sub and you won't see from outside the sub. You only see it in this transitional zone. Of course, there is also some modern equipment here in the casing because the sub is moored to the shore and does not run under her own power, except for very rarely when they fire up the engines. And so there have to be power cables and lights and so forth strung under here for when it's not quite as bright as it is on the day that I was actually present. But these large black pipes and winches and so forth, all of this is original. And one of those features, as you can see on the right, is an aircon unit, which is very much appreciated by everybody who goes aboard. Just to the left, however, there you can see the slide for reloading the torpedoes coming down below the deck. Now, of course, visitors, including myself at this point, are going to enter through a hatch cut into the pressure hull, which is not how most of the crew would normally have gone in and out. Up on deck, you would have seen a small circular hatch up top. That would have been the normal way of getting in and out if you didn't go via the ship's sail and thus the conning tower. But well, there's probably all sorts of health and safety things about sending visitors down a vertical ladder in a small steel tube, so we get to explore the inner part of the casing of the sub before we head in. And speaking of heading in, down we go. Now, you are getting essentially my eye view of things because I've got a camera strapped to my head for this. So there we go, down through, and we're into the forward torpedo room and also bunking facilities. Now, obviously, at the start of the ship's war patrol, this area would be considerably more full of torpedoes, but now it only has a relative few torpedoes in it, which allows the bunks to be pulled down so you can see a little bit more of what's going on and indeed come forward all the way in between the torpedoes to the forwardmost station aboard the sub. And I apologise for the lighting in some parts of the video sections within the sub, as unfortunately the one thing head cameras don't tend to have is a particularly wide lens, and so they don't do too well with low light conditions. But as you can see here in this static photograph, the man who has to sit on the little green seat up here right in the bow, amongst other things, has this grey machine in front of him, and that actually sets the gyro settings for the torpedoes, which obviously means that the submarine is capable of firing torpedoes not just in a dead straight line ahead, but in theory they can make the torpedoes turn by a certain degree once they have left the tubes, which allows off-angle shooting, means you don't have to aim the entire sub at a target. Of course, exactly what angle he should be setting would normally, in a ship like this, be set by the torpedo data computer, and that information would come forward to here. Also in this vicinity, amongst the various other things, are a couple of these bow plane tilt indicators, which are very useful for working out if you're going up or down, because believe me, if you're at some of the shallower angles there, you might not be able to tell. And you can also see up there poppet valves for the torpedo tubes. And this tells you important information like whether or not the torpedo tubes are open or shut, which is rather important if you wish to stay, well, if you're in a sub, not necessarily afloat, but at least with the water outside. And then as we come back from that station, we can have a look at the loading end of the sub's forward torpedo tubes and see some of the instrumentation that's involved there. This is the point where I remember I have a phone torch, so I can actually see my way out, and you can see a little bit more of the detail there. So here we see one of the torpedo tubes is open, and you've got a little brass roller there which enables you to roll or push a torpedo into it. And opposite, on the upper port side tube, you can see this little pressure dial which tells you how much compressed air is available to shoot the torpedo out. And in case you're wondering, that little screw to the left, although it's upside down, it says before loading, screw out 2 turns, and then after loading, screw in to contact, and then back off 1/10 of a turn. And it quite handily has an out and in arrow as well. This is what it looks like inside one of said torpedo tubes. Refreshingly simple if you've had a look inside more modern submarines torpedo tubes. There's just a set of guide rails for the torpedo, and that's pretty much it. And below the level that you'll be standing on, since you're standing on a set of plates, there is of course another set of torpedoes for the lower tubes. And yes, on the top right, that is a heater, because of course this is the very northern edge of the United States, so they need both heaters for the colder climes and air conditioners for when it gets a little bit warmer to keep the sub habitable for visitors. And above your head in this area is a whole series of levers and valves which allow you to blow that compressed air through the torpedo tubes. Now, the sharp-eyed among you will notice there are more than 6 here. There are in fact 8. Now, going from right to left, you do indeed have 6 valves and levers which are for the torpedo tubes. They're numbered odd and even, so not in sequence, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because of course the tubes are in rows of 2, and so depending on if you count left, right, left, right, left, right, or up, down, and up, down, you will get different sequences of numbers. The second from left set is for the trim tank, which, well, as its name suggests, is for trimming the sub. And the very last one on the furthest left is labelled WRT tank. And that is the weapon round tank. Now that is a tank that is obviously full of water, and this contains enough water to fill the intervening space between the torpedoes and the walls of their tubes for all 6 tubes. So if you want to fire a torpedo, you first have to get the torpedo into the tube, but then you also have to fill that tube with water. Now, why is this important? Why don't you just open the outer doors to fire the torpedoes? Well, two reasons, or at least two primary reasons. One of which is that at any significant depth, and that includes periscope depth when you realize how tall the periscope is relative to the position of these tubes, the water pressure, if you just have air in the tubes, is probably going to be too much to allow you to open the doors properly. So you need to even that up with water and potentially pressurized water. The other factor, of course, is that if you were to just open the torpedo tube doors up front and let water pour in, that means air is going to pour out. And of course, submarines need as much air on board as they possibly can, especially in the days of the diesel-electric subs. But also, you'd have a bunch of air shooting out, which would then rise to the surface and be something of a positional giveaway. Once you fire the torpedo, the trim tank comes into play because the weight of water that's come into the tube to a certain degree offsets the weight of the lost torpedo, but not entirely. So unless you want the sub to go bow up immediately upon firing the torpedo, you do have to admit some more water to trim the sub. And of course, if you want to reload that tube, you are going to have to pump that tube dry, which now means all the water that was in there is going to be gone. So for reloads, you need to further use the trim tank again, otherwise you're going to end up bow up. And then as we come back through the forward torpedo room, again, you can see the bunks that will be lowered for the crew when there weren't quite so many Mark 14s present. And there's the torpedo loading hatch viewed from the inside. So it'll go back there to where all the torpedoes are stored. There's a little toilet just on the left, and then it's through the hatchway. Now, as you pass through the hatchway, you'll see there is a locked door there on the left. That's me turning off my phone torch because this bit's better lit. And then just swinging around so you can look back through this hatch into the forward torpedo room. It's a little bit of a low one, so you do have to swing. And then we come to this area on the port side, or the right-hand side as you're going aft. And believe it or not, this isn't actually the sub's galley, although on other subs it's about the size to be a galley. In fact, this is the pantry. This is where the officers' food gets plated up, ready to be served to them in the officers' wardroom, which is immediately aft. Which, of course, means as we exit, there's the officers' wardroom. And there's a bit of a story to this wardroom. And who better to tell it than one of the sub's current crew?
So this is before Christmas in 1942. A crewman came up with a hot appendix, and so they decided that they would have to do an appendectomy or the guy would die. In 1942, they wouldn't pull a sub off patrol for one guy who had a medical problem. So they convinced the skipper convinced the pharmacist mate to do the appendectomy. So they took the ship down. It's between 100 and 150 feet underwater. Different accounts have different depths. They put him on the table. There's more extensions, more leaves on the table. And then because his legs were hanging out into the companionway, they put an ironing board out there so his feet would be out there. They gave him a spinal anesthetic, and we're not entirely sure what a pharmacist mate would be doing with a spinal anesthetic, but maybe the rules were different then.
Don't ask questions.
Anyway, they cut him open and found the hot appendix right away. But then the pharmacist mate had a bleeder, and it took him hours to find the bleeder. In fact, the guy on the table woke up and said, "Doc, you need to hurry up because I can feel this." And he's starting to flop around. So then they gave him some ether. In the submarine, 100 to 150 feet underwater. And so pretty soon everybody was feeling the effects of ether. Eventually, it took about 4.5 hours. They eventually found the bleeder, tied it off. The guy was back at work 6 days later and lived more than 60 years after the end of the war. Wow. And that was the third one they did in 42 on a sub, and the Navy outlawed him after that. I think it's because the docs thought the pharmacist mates were cutting into their business.
Now, this all happened on the sub's fourth patrol. That was a patrol to be remembered. In fact, probably the best way of describing what happened after the unplanned underwater surgery is to just read the account of one of the sailors who was there. He says, "First, the surgery, which drained most of Silverside's batteries. After Platter," that's the guy who was being operated on, "was tucked in bed recovering, Silversides had to surface to run and recharge. An enemy destroyer suddenly charged out of the mist, forcing us under with depth charges on our tail. When we finally came up, a plane was circling and dropped more on top of us. It was a full day of misery, and there was plenty of damage to repair. It was so bad that Platter was thrown out of his bunk. We sank a tanker a few days later, and suddenly we began to be depth charged every time we were underwater. Finally, we figured out why. The tanker's escorts had bombed us and ruptured a small leak in the oil tank, leaving a telltale slick on the surface for all to see. Then one of the generators caught fire. Hours after that, we surfaced and opened the air valves to feed the engines, only to have them sputter and die. We were now sitting ducks without those engines and looked for the cause. We found it too. It was a box of cream of wheat that had fallen into the pipe and got crammed in there. Finally, on the way again, Davenport saw a piece of metal glinting on the deck while on lookout. He sent Roland Fournier to pick it up and discovered a fragment of our own torpedo, which had flown 3/4 of a mile from that tanker back to us. Then we found a beautiful convoy, all lined up perfectly to pick off. We stalked her, aimed and fired a spread of 6 torpedoes, and heard 5 explosions. The escorts punished us again, but that could be expected given our history. Except that the 6th torpedo hadn't missed. The 6th torpedo, armed, was stuck halfway out of its tube while we were being depth charged. Grace of God is all I can figure that we survived. Next morning, 6 volunteers locked themselves in the forward torpedo room. If it was still armed, it might have gone off as soon as it left the tube, and the rest of us put Silversides into full speed reverse. The shot went off harmlessly, thank God, but that night we discovered a new oil leak, and now also an air leak. We went home 2 days early. The apparently cursed nature of the 4th patrol aside, we're going back further down the sub, so obviously we're in officer country, so there's some officer quarters, there's the wardroom again, more officer quarters, you'll notice a little folding basin for shaving and washing in the morning, a single occupancy room, a triple occupancy room, and bear in mind, these are the more luxurious parts of accommodation aboard a submarine, at least aboard this one. This is the yeoman's office, complete with typewriter, so he can type out signals and potentially also decode ones that are coming in once they have been transcribed. Now we go through another hatchway and we will find ourselves in the control room. Whee! Like the torpedo rooms and the engine room, the control room is quite a large compartment, being about 20 foot long and about 10 foot wide, with watertight hatches at either end. Obviously you can see we're going through one at the front and you can see the aft one straight ahead on this photo. Now, within the control room are a wide variety of, surprisingly enough, controls, as well as other equipment. There's 2 18-inch gyroscopic compasses, which have their outputs relayed all through the boat. Those are the 2 grey shapes you can just see on the right-hand side there on the floor. Up front, you've got the primary steering position. There is also a repeat of this station in the conning tower, which is directly above us in the sub's sail. And you can see just to the top right of the wheel, you've got the first of one of the many gyro compass repeaters. At the top left, you've got a sounding indicator. Top right, you've got the ship's speed in knots, as well as indicators for what each of the sub's engines are doing, which are just to the right of the sounding indicator, each with a brass adjusting dial on them. On the port side of the control room is the dive station, so all of those handles you can see with a little signboard on them, they operate the ballast tank vent valves, so that allows the boat to dive, and just above that, the red and green lights show the open and close status of every hatch on the submarine, so you can work out, is it safe to dive? Although there is apparently also a safety cutout that means you can't actually dive the sub while the main hatch is open, which is probably a good thing. Further aft along the port side, using the same wheels as the steering station up front, is the area where you control the ship's diving planes. One wheel for the forward planes, one wheel for the aft planes. And you'll notice that while at the steering station you have an inclinometer that tells you how much the sub is rolling, over here at the top right you can see another inclinometer, and of course that tells you what angle the sub is pitching or diving at. Now, of course, for redundancy and to ease repairs, they're using, as we mentioned, the same wheel as on the steering station. And just a quick note, when you look at the U505 video, that's why I got a little bit confused when we were in the similar room aboard U505, because this is the equivalent control station on a German Type 9 U-boat. And I looked at those little command consoles labeled BBC and went, I know what these are. I have one of these. those brass plungers are for steering to port and starboard. When in fact, well, yes, the one I have is, and the one in the forward part of U505 is, but these, much like the wheels on Silversides, are identical units, except in this case linked to the dive planes. So apologies for that minor error in the previous video. And back on Silversides, you'll notice there's a variety of gauges which the crew can use to ascertain exactly what's going on. Obviously, they're mirrored for each dive plane, but if you look on the far right, just underneath the inclinometer, you'll notice a much more detailed inclinometer that is handily labelled both rise and dive, so that shows precisely what angle you've got things at, as opposed to the bubble level, which shows you what angle the sub is at. That's not necessarily the same angle as what you've set the dive planes to. You've also got the two biggest ones, which are the saltwater depth to keel, so that's how far it is from the surface to the bottom of the sub, and you'll see that's even labelled with the specific gravity of seawater, which is different from freshwater. So if you're in a particularly salty or freshwater environment, you know you have to slightly adjust those measures. And then at the very top centre, there's another depth gauge, but this one is the depth from surface in feet for wherever that sensor is positioned. Now, obviously, those values are going to be slightly different because one is at the keel and one is higher up on the sub. And that smaller one is still very important because if you're just going by depth to keel, you could still think you're at 20 to 25 feet, but your sail is going to be above the water, which is not necessarily what you want. So you also need to know what the depth to the surface is from up top of the sub. So that's what your center dial is for. And just after this area, all these brass valves you can see here are for the trim tanks to help trim the sub. And just to the left, you can see this set of electronics, which looks to have been rather shoehorned in. And that's because it has been shoehorned in. That's all to do with the ship's radar installation, which of course was not part of the original Gato class design. Also present here is a ladder that goes up into the conning tower, but as you just saw, there's a mesh grid there. You can't actually go in the conning tower under most conditions, but fortunately I have a camera that can attach to a very long stick, so you can see what the conning tower looks like without having to go up there. So as we pan around to the front, you can see there is the secondary steering section. It's much more compact, obviously, than the control room. You've got various repeaters, dials and so forth, and you can see the periscopes are here, obviously heading out up top of the sail, and you can see the control levers there, the control arms, because this is where you would actually look through the periscopes. So the captain would be up here while we head back down. Now on the starboard side, we have this rather wonderful electrical power distribution box, which, as you can see by the labels, controls power across the entirety of the sub. Dominating most of the starboard side of the control room is this massive array of pressure gauges, which are all connected to the various ballast tanks, as opposed to the trim tanks over on the port side. And below those are the valves for blowing high pressure air in to clear the ballast tanks if you want to surface. And these large pipes are actually used to move lower pressure air around, generated by the sub itself rather than from the compressed air tanks. And that helps clear out the tanks when you're on the surface, and obviously you can use engine power instead, which saves you use of compressed air. Now, another area that you can't access, and I couldn't even get my camera down into, which is below the control room, is a very small compartment which contains a variety of high-pressure air compressors, refrigeration, blowers, and various pumps of various kinds. You can, in theory, go down there on an active sub, but it's a very, very small space. And in the middle of the control room, right aft, is the radio room, which again, as you can see, is perspex off. So this is where signals would actually be sent and received, although they could then be taken to the yeoman's office for sorting or decoding or various other tasks as well. But this is where the actual electronics are all kept. And then if you come aft through this hatch just here, then we enter into the galley space. So this is where all the food would actually be prepared, which is just as well because here's the mess for all the regular crew. So it can be passed through that little slot there or brought through the door. But this is where you would eat if you're part of the submarine's crew, unless of course you're the officers, in which case you have your little wardroom up front. And you can see more galley equipment actually in the mess area itself, including a refrigerator. Unfortunately, there was no ice cream in there. And then heading directly after that, we find there's a hatchway up to the outside world, if you wish to go there. But if we head through this curtain, directly after the galley is where a bunch of the crew would be sleeping. In fact, most of them. Believe it or not, that's actually 3 bunks on each side as you come straight through, and then you come through here and you can see more triple stacked bunks. So you're actually up to 9 people already just in this first row of bunks. And then as we pan around, coming to our left, we can see there's 2 more rows of bunks, but unlike just behind us, where there's 3 sets across, you can see here there are 4 sets across. So you've got 3 in each stack, multiplied by 2 is 6, multiplied by another 4 is 24, so plus the 9 we've just gone past, and you can get 33 of the sub's crew just in this one compartment, which is just over half the total of the men who would be aboard in typical circumstances, with the rest, of course, either being up in Officers' Country Forward or in the fore or aft torpedo rooms. Continuing to head aft, there's a washroom facility, so there is a small shower, plus 2 sinks, which we just saw, and just opposite, there is a twin toilet cubicle. Yep, you can actually fit 2 toilets in a space that small, which of course has another pull-down sink. And then as we continue to head aft, we come to the first of 2 diesel engine rooms. Now, there are actually 3 diesels in each engine room. There's 2 main ones and an auxiliary. The auxiliary, however, is only really visible to the casual observer by the fact that there is a little exhaust stack coming up through what appears to be the deck. You just saw it pass there on the right. But this is all a little bit deceptive. You feel like you're on a deck, but if you look at the sides of the hull and so forth, what you're actually on is a scaffold, and what appear to be the engines on the left and right hand side as you go through are in fact just the top of 2 very much larger engines. There are actually hinged deck openings to what's called the lower flats where you can access the rest of the engines, but again, that's not part of the regular tour route. Each of the 4 main engines is rated at 1600 horsepower, and unlike on some submarines, they're not actually linked directly to the ship's propeller shafts. They're in fact a kind of turboelectric drive where each diesel engine drives a generator which generates electrical power. That electrical power is then fed to the electric motors, which then are connected to the prop shafts, which are then obviously connected to the props. And that means that when it's running off batteries, you don't have to switch around. You just supply power to the motors from the batteries instead of from the generators. And of course, the generators will be resupplying the batteries whilst the sub is on the surface. Also found in these compartments are fuel purifiers, because of course, as fuel is drawn out of the fuel tanks, it's replaced by seawater, but you don't want seawater in the diesels. So you have to purify that fuel. The reason for the seawater coming in, of course, is so that as you use up your fuel, you don't just become hilariously buoyant and pop to the surface. And there are also stills in here, not for producing alcohol, although there may be a alcohol producing still somewhere on the sub, but the official stills are for producing fresh water, so people have something to drink and something to cook with and something to clean themselves with. And if you're wondering where the batteries are on the sub, because of course there are quite a few of them, once again, they are below the route that you would normally walk, because the deck plating, such as it seems, is actually roughly speaking about halfway up the pressure hull. So what you're actually walking through effectively is the top half of the sub, and the lower half is where you have the batteries and, as we mentioned earlier, things like compressor pumps and so forth, and a lot of the tanks. Once you're past the engine rooms, you head through this narrow passageway, and this is where what I like to call the big electricity is managed. Because, of course, we saw there's a power distribution console over in the control room, which allows you to switch the lights on and off in the sub, but you need considerably more power to make a several thousand-ton submarine move through the water. And so here you have a control compartment for all of that, with some rather lovely large lever switches. And this is the part where anyone who's worked in almost any field of engineering starts to feel their hairs on the back of their neck go up and start backing away slowly, unless you're incredibly experienced in rather specific fields, because you might think, oh, look, it's just a bunch of indicators. Yes, they are a bunch of indicators. Look at the middle ones. Yeah, the top ones say volts. The lower ones say amps or amperes. The ones in the middle say kiloamps. Kiloamps are very bad news. You do not want to get exposed to kiloamps. If you are exposed to kiloamps, well, there is a dustpan and brush aboard. Fortunately, however, as you can see, most of those indicators are at 0, and I'm rather hoping the ones that aren't are just a little bit broken. Yeah, there's some serious energies flowing through a sub, even a US fleet sub, which by World War II standards is very large, but by modern standards is actually quite small. And behind that, finally, is the aft torpedo room. Again, with the bunks, you can see people would live here. And the aft torpedo room is essentially just a slightly smaller version of the forward torpedo room. There are only 4 tubes here instead of 6. And as you can probably see, the hull feels considerably narrower, because indeed it is narrowing down. We are right up at the stern. And these tubes give the sub a considerable flexibility. Amongst other things, if a ship pops up aft of the sub, it means they don't have to turn the whole thing around to take pot shot. If there's a large convoy, or just a very large target, like say a carrier, you can obviously unload your forward tubes, and then as you spin around to get out of there, you can let them have it with the aft tubes. If you're being pursued by escorts, then again, aft tubes are very useful. And as some US submarine captains would do, it also allows you to go into the middle of an enemy convoy, surface, or just maybe stick your periscope up. Surfacing was more usually done at night. And then you can start spraying torpedoes in a kind of mad 360 spin at everything in sight, because as you start to bring the sub around, obviously you can start loosing torpedoes from both fore and aft tubes. And if the convoy is in several parallel columns, well, then you get to hit everything at once. Then you can dive, reload, and either repeat the process or head on off for safety whilst listening for all the lovely explosions. And that's a quick run through USS Silversides, as I said, over in Muskegon. I would highly recommend a visit. They've got a wonderful museum next to the sub with a whole load of artifacts, accounts, etc., which is in and of itself, half a day's worth of visit as well. I haven't shown you any of that. There's a very well supplied gift shop, and it's just overall a fantastic place to visit. And as you can see, even though this was September, the weather was pretty nice. So thank you very much to the crew of USS Silversides for letting me come aboard and do all this filming and picture taking, and for, of course, telling both myself and all you lovely subscribers who showed up that day all about the sub, its history, and what all the various buttons and valves and levers all did. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.